What's going on, kids, as we pick back up here for the Rhyme Time Social Studies. And if I'm looking back at last week, I feel like we kind of rushed through the Native American homes portion, if we even really got to cover that thoroughly enough. So we're going to go back over that today before we start digging into the Native American trade slides that we have ready for today. Now, we remember as we first started studying Native Americans that there were different tribes that were all across the United States in different areas. And these tribes in different areas had some differences in their cultures and things that they grew and things that they hunted, and their homes were a little different as well. And we're just really going to start looking at three of the most prominent Native American homes, and that would be the teepee, the one that I think we're all probably familiar with, the longhouse that some girls and I stayed after school and tried to build, and we did not do a fantastic job, but we did have fun and we learned a lot doing it, and the pueblo, one that we probably don't look into much at all. So let's look first here at the teepee. The teepee, I would say, as it is in this first paragraph here, is probably the most famous of the Native American homes. You can see here it comes from the Lakota word teepee, which means a dwelling or a place to live. These tent-like structures were typically covered with buffalo skins. Now, this is a pretty massive structure here. Some of these things were like 9, 10, 12 feet tall, so that's quite a few buffalo skins to go across that, although buffaloes are fairly large as well. And one of the biggest reasons why tribes would use teepees is these tribes were typically ones that moved very often. They weren't tribes that stayed in place. And much like a tent that you can have to go camping and hiking, you are using that to set up a shelter to stay in a specific place for a short amount of time, and then you are moving on in your travels. Now, a lot of these Native Americans were hunters and gatherers, so if the hunting and gathering started to slow as maybe seasons changed or animals adapted and moved somewhere else, these Native Americans would wrap up these teepees and take them and move somewhere else. They were very, very quick. I do like the little chimney feature here because in the wintertime it does get kind of cold, and that's not a lot of insulation, so you would need to have some warmth inside of that, and that allowed the smoke to come out of the top. So there is our Native American teepee. This is the Native American longhouse, and as the name would suggest, it's a very long house. They were about 200 feet long and 20 feet wide. Maybe we can measure that out during recess this week and kind of mark off about how big that would be. They have this long hallway down the middle, and if you've ever stayed in like a hotel, you have that long hallway, and off to each side of you, on the right and the left side of you, are the rooms. That's sort of what this was like. They had one common area, which would kind of be like the lobby of the hotel, and then you would walk down that long hall down the middle, and then the rooms for all the different families were off to the side. And as many as 60 people, that's a lot of people, y'all. As many as 60 people could live in one longhouse. So the longhouse was there, and I guess you could look at it as like an apartment or like a hotel. The way the hotel is shaped is very, very similar. Last but not least, we have the pueblo. Shocking, the Pueblo Indians made these homes. And they were made of clay, water, and earth and straw, and they formed these bricks, and you can kind of see them in the background there. The bricks were formed, and then they were dried in the sun, and then they were used to make these tall, rectangular-looking homes. Almost like if it says here like a shoebox. If you were to take a shoebox and sit it on its end, and it was odd. They many times didn't have doors in the front. Obviously, you can see these obviously do, but sometimes they didn't have doors in the front. They had you had to climb up a ladder and enter through the roof, and this was more of a safety type of a measure that the Native Americans would take then. So we've kind of covered the Native American homes, and now we're going to jump into the trading that Native Americans would do. So let's take a quick look here at Native American trade, the different things that Native Americans might trade, whether they were trading amongst other tribes or they were trading with the early explorers, or whether they were trading with the colonists. Once they started to come into America, the Native Americans would often trade for things. Now, when I say trade, we're not talking, basketball cards or Pokemon cards. That's not what they traded. Typically, if I'm trading something, I might trade a video game to my friend. He gives me a video game that I've been wanting to play. I give him one that he wants to play. And we probably end up giving it back to each other in the end anyway. And it's not really a cash-like transaction. When the Native Americans were doing their trading, these were things like, I need this and you need this, so we're going to make this almost cash transaction. So like if I need something from the store, I go to the store and I give them money and I get what I need. They didn't really have money like that. So they would say, I need some metal and I would be happy to trade you some fur for the metal that you have. And then they would make that trade. So what are some things that you think that they may have traded? Take a minute to think about that. If you need to pause the video, that's fine. And then we will move on and talk about the things that they traded the most often. So I think it is important, and I think that most people understand what I say when I'm talking about trading, but trading is when you exchange something for something else. I give you this, and you give me that. And so it just depends on what that trade might be. And there's some different things that you could look at trading if you were a Native American. So if a Native American needed something, or if they wanted something, and that wanting of things came in later, most of the times when they were trading to begin with, it was out of necessity. I need this thing for my family or my tribe, and later on it became more of a want. And so some of the things that the Native Americans said, hey, I have this, I will give you this, in return you give me something back. They had furs. As some of you have seen and did an excellent job in class, there was handmade jewelry. Obviously there was fish. The Native Americans lived on the land, so they were able to chop down trees, and so they would be able to furnish wood to people to help build homes, or maybe fix a boat that may have been needed repair after coming across the seas. And then they had corn, and they had other crops as well. But we're just going to get into corn for today. The fur trade. This is probably what we'll spend the majority of our time on today, is the fur trade. Native Americans would give the settlers furs, and in exchange for those furs, they would get weapons. So instead of having to use a bow and arrow, they would get they only get a gun. And you can imagine the difference in hunting with a gun versus a bow and arrow. They would get those metals that I talked about that you could use for all sorts of things, and they would get some other supplies as well. The settlers would take these furs back home. And back in Europe, the very, very rich people loved to have furs. It was kind of like, if I have fur, then it shows everybody else how rich I am. And so they would take, whether it was beaver fur, fox, mink, and different types of fur, and they would make clothing. They would make hats, different things like that that they would use to kind of show off their stature, and as they were moving around in Europe, to say, hey, look, basically, look how rich I am. I have furs. The Dutch were amazed at the great deals they were getting on furs. And here's the thing. The people in Europe spent a lot of money on furs because it was very valuable to them. The Native Americans, and as you see here, the Lenape, they valued fur in a different way. Fur wasn't like this, oh, look at me, I have on fur. Fur was just kind of like a necessity. Food and clothing and shelter and wood were all things that you just kind of needed to live if you were a Native American. And so furs weren't really a status item. It was just something you had to have in order to survive. So they used their fur a little bit differently, but the Dutch were like, hey, man, we're making a fortune off of this. For the longest time, Native American men only hunted for survival, to get food and clothing. But once that fur trading started, the men quickly turned into basically professional fur hunters and trappers. This kept them away from their homes more often, and we know that that caused a huge shift in the way things ran because we've already talked about the roles of men and women in the Native American society. If you know that the man is no longer at home because he's so busy hunting, then the women of the village had to take on more roles and more jobs, and they already had enough as it is. So wealth wasn't something that was very familiar to the Native Americans. They thought like cooperating and sharing was being wealthy, not I have a bunch of stuff. And as time went by, having stuff and having quote unquote wealth became more and more important. And it started to cause friction in tribes themselves, and it started to cause friction between different tribes as they would go to war over lands and areas that were very good for hunting. It wasn't just fur. We've already said it earlier that they would sell the wood from the forest needed for homes and boats as well. And because they were so skilled at hunting and fishing, Native Americans would trade meat among themselves with explorers, and eventually they would trade meat with the settlers as well. Native Americans also grew and traded corn, and we're just going to focus on this one crop for right now. And if you're like me and most other people, like this is probably the picture that comes to your mind when I say they grew corn. And true, this is some of the corn that they grew, but there are other different types of corn I want us to take a look at today, and they are actually kind of interesting. So you'll notice I have this attached, this history of corn attached in the Google assignment as well. In Google Classroom, you can watch that one on your own. We'll skip past that. This is something that you probably have seen before. This is what people call Indian corn or flint corn. We typically see that about this time of the year. And for the most part, I don't think people are really putting this out to eat. It's more of a decorative type of thing. You might see that like laying in a cornucopia or something. It might be with some hay and some pumpkins to make things look super fall-like. And I'm fairly certain there's probably some girls out there on Instagram with corn and hay and pumpkins and their pumpkin spice lattes from Starbucks taking pictures with some pretty angry boyfriends in the background who would probably rather be watching Marvel movies or something. But we'll talk about that more later. Anyway, this is another corn that they grew. It can be eaten. It's not eaten the way that we think. You're not really going to like boil this. This is not a corn that you're going to have like corn on the cob. You're going to grind this up into a meal and have something like polenta, which is kind of like grits is about the best way I can describe it. Maybe not the best description, but that's close enough. This article is attached for you to read as well. It talks a little bit, as you can see down here, about Indian corn. You can read that once you've finished watching the videos and taking the quiz. All right, so we've got about a minute and a half left here, and I do want to show you something that I think is unbelievably amazing. And I don't know that you're actually ready for this, but I'm going to show it to you anyway. So if you're ready, we're going to turn to the next page. And this is not Photoshop. This is not fake. This is real. This is actual real corn, and I think it's probably the coolest thing I've seen in a long, long time. I've sat and stared at this same picture for a long, long while, and I'm just amazed at the different variety of colors that you can see in this ear of corn. This is called glass gem corn. If my next slide will hurry up and load, not too sure what it's doing. There we go, glass gem corn. And it is the coolest thing that I've seen in a long, long time. It looks like someone glued like polished little pebbles together to look like corn, but it's not. It's actually a real corn. And the history behind how this came about is really amazing. There was a half Cherokee gentleman who was studying the different types of corn that his people grew in the past. And I don't know if we'll have time to really dig into that. Maybe we can make a podcast about it. This is not a corn that you can eat. And it's not something I mean, it would be kind of cool if we could have this corn like glass gem corn and pizza on pizza days, but it's not something that's going to happen. You're probably going to grind this up as well. But what I've learned in the video that I attached is you can also pop this as popcorn. Now, I'm pretty certain it doesn't pop in these colors, which would be super cool if it did. And I don't know, we'll look into it, see if we can order some and get some in the class. Well, that's it. Don't forget, kiddos, smash that like button and subscribe, and we will see you later.